Hello, everyone. My name is Mina Chen. I'm a second-year PhD student from Cornell University in the Information Science Department. And today I'm proudly to present this work on behalf of my collaborators. And the work is called Pathways, Exploring Academic Interests with Historical Course Enrollment Records. So let's get started. Um, College students today need to adapt to careers that are increasingly complex and rapidly changing due to digitization, automation. So let's look back and see how students experience from admission to graduation in order to prepare for such careers. So typically, a student would first spend a short amount of time choosing some courses and then taking those courses. And then based on their experience with those courses, they may choose some new courses in a new semester and then take those courses. And the cycle continues. And at a certain point of their academic career, they may declare a major. So by the end of a college education, a student would experience through what we define as an academic pathway, which is essentially semesters of courses. So a lot of research focuses on the learning that happens when students are taking courses. But here in our work, we want to talk about the learning that happens when students are choosing courses. And we want to highlight that exploring and developing an academic pathway is not only indeed a learning process, it is a constructivist learning process that can help students prepare for their careers. So why is that? Well, first, students continuously explore, construct, and reflect on their learning path as they will do so after graduation for their careers. And second, students develop pathways from their own experience as opposed to being taught by an expert about the right path. So, how to facilitate the learning process of building an academic pathway? A main approach that students take is to learn from their senior students, to learn about the courses that they've taken, to engage in informal conversations. But because the social network that students have are often limited and homogeneous, the students often face information biases when learning about others' course taking patterns. Luckily, these kind of information is stored in every institution's database, which is historical course enrollment records. So here in our work, we aim to make these kind of pathway data accessible to all students through data visualization. So we developed a student-facing system that supports academic exploration at scale by visualizing past students' pathway data. We call the system Pathways. And our theoretical foundation is interest exploration because interest is an essential foundation that motivates a student to formulate their unique academic pathway. So specifically, we borrowed from literature in interest development that distinguishes two psychological constructs. One is situational interest, which is transient and is affected by external environmental factors. And the second construct is individual interest, which is developed from situational interest and is enduring and stable. So here we claim that exploration facilitates situational interest to be triggered and individual interest to be evolved. So to design the system, we first conducted a formative study and we raised two research questions. The first research question is, what challenges do students face when exploring their interests during course consideration? And the second research question is, how do students identify and develop their interests through courses? For methods, we conducted semi-structured interviews with 12 participants who are undergraduate students from the present university. So for the first research question, the challenges that students face, our main finding is that students face an overwhelming number of competing factors during course consideration. For example, they not only need to think about their interest, but also course requirements, the difficulty of the course, the timing of the course, etc. So to deal with this, students often consider factors at different decision stages so that they only need to face one or two factors at one particular decision stage. But the way that students prioritize these factors by order of stages is different, which means that if interest comes in late in the decision stages, then it limits the scope for exploration. So here, a design implication that we draw is that for pathways, we focus on students' early decision stages to expand their awareness and consideration of course options before excluding them from the start. And then for our second research question, how do students identify and develop their interests through courses? A main finding that we have is that students do so through what we call serendipitous discovery, meaning that students didn't really have a clear understanding of their interest at the start. They didn't find their interest intentionally. It's often unexpectedly. So, for example, one of our participants thought that she was interested in food science, but she realized she didn't enjoy the biology classes that's required as much as her peers. It wasn't until a course called Food and Consumers that made her realize she was actually interested in the marketing side of food industry. So she transitioned into marketing and fell in love with it. But initially, she didn't even know the concept of marketing. So here, for our design implication, we want to create affordances for these kind of serendipitous discoveries. And so more specifically, that means we show students information that are not necessarily relevant to their indicated interest. We also show some irrelevant information that may be unexpectedly useful. So for our pathway system, we take an approach called data storytelling to design the system. This is a technique to communicate complicated information and data to audience. And so this technique is often used in journalism. It's originated in journalism, but recent years it has been adopted to educational settings as a teachable tool. So this technique, it highlights an overarching goal through a series of steps with narratives and data visualizations. And in our context, the overarching goal is to promote interest exploration while students are considering courses. So here, allow me to introduce the pathway system. It follows 3 steps. The first step is searching for the interest. And the second step is to show students matches of courses that is relevant to their interest. And step 3 is to show them pathway matches. And for step 2, it is meant to be a stepping stone for serendipitous discoveries before actually showing student results that extend from their indicated interest. So here is the interface for the step 1 search. We ask students to describe in a few sentences what they're interested in studying. Underneath the prompt, there is an example search query. We intentionally designed the search query to be lengthy and the search box underneath to be large in order to encourage students to write more about their interest. And then the next step, step 2, is a result page of matching courses. So here courses are matched based on the student's search query in step 1 and the course description that is stored in the institution's database, which means that the courses that we show matched to the student's interests are not constrained to one particular subject. And so the last step, step 3, pathway matches. Before showing students actual pathways, we first show them a selection of a pool of courses that do not match the student's interest but may unexpectedly match. And because the reason that we have this intermediate step is because a big challenge for serendipitous discovery is to know what kind of unexpected information may be useful. And so with this kind of user interaction, we want to create affordances for students to seek out serendipitous discoveries. And it also helps us to gather more input from the student to calibrate our search algorithm. Finally, we show student pathway visualizations. This is one example of a full pathway visualization from a previous student. Here you can see each hexagon represents a course and it's color coded by course subjects. So courses are lined up semester by semester vertically in a chronological order. It shows a course taking pattern that the students have, how it evolves over time, and it also evokes a personal story. And I also want to mention here that for this pathway, this student happened to not take any course in the second semester of their first year. That's why it's blank there. And this is not usual. And so underneath the visualization, students can click through pages to flip through multiple pathways. And so after describing the interface side, I also want to talk about the search algorithm for pathway visualization. And we used cosine similarity between the TF-IDF vector of the search query and the course descriptions to obtain the relevant score for each course. And then we kept for the top relevant courses and counted the number of relevant courses in a pathway to obtain the relevant score of a pathway. And I want to highlight here that we used two metrics for search results. One is relevance metric, which is generally used in search algorithms. It is defined by the number of relevant courses in a set of pathway visualizations, not just one, because we're showing students multiple pathways. But we also added another metric, which is a diversity metric. The diversity metric is defined by the number of non-overlapping courses in a set of pathway visualizations. And our search result intend to achieve maximum for both relevance and diversity. So with this system, we then conducted an evaluation study. We raised two research questions. The first one is, does pathways support students to explore their interests? And the second question is, how do students use pathway to explore their interests and academic pathways? For methods, we recruited 15 participants who are undergraduate students from the present university. The experimenters observed participants exploring pathways following a think aloud protocol, and then we conducted semi-structured interviews and surveys afterwards. So following are the results. Here is the result from our survey of research question 1. It shows that students generally agree that they see both relevance and diversity in the results. They have succeeded in finding courses that are not just interesting to them, but also unexpected, so showing some extent of the serendipitous discovery. And also students generally agree that they are interested in using the tool in the future or recommend it to a friend. So I want to talk more about research question 2, which is using pathways as a technology probe and asking the question, how do students use it to explore their interests and their academic pathways? And I want to share 3 findings. The first finding is, we're surprised to see how students struggle to articulate their interests. They feel unease to write their interest in full sentences. And so often the time students would write their majors or their intended majors if they haven't declared one yet. But it gets easier when students read the example queries and browse through courses and pathways. So here is one example. We have participant 13 who initially wrote security as his interest, just one keyword. But after reading through the example queries, he wrote that I'm interested in system securities, something in the computational area, computational field, and mechanical physics. So here we can see how this student's interest become enriched. And the second finding that we have is that students can be resistant to interest exploration. And one of the main reasons behind this is that for some students, they believe they've already committed to an interest. And this is often formalized by their major, which means that once a student declared a major, they cease to explore. But we also observe that this is not a universal phenomena. For some other students, they can stay open-minded about exploration even after they declared a major. So here is a rather encouraging quote from participant 9, who is a fourth year student. She said that, I think this application will be a cool way to connect to what I'm pursuing for next semester. Like maybe I don't want to just do marketing communications. Maybe I want a photography class. Maybe there's a class that incorporates photography with communication. So here we can see how the student is trying to incorporate her multiple interests. And the last finding is that students gain new insights from pathway visualizations. And one particular one that I want to share here is how students are able to extend our working definition of diversity. So initially for us, we in our search algorithm, we defined diversity merely by course topics. For pathways, it may contain computer science course, contain an art course, and that's how we define the diversity. But students are able to point out richer meaning of diversity, not just in terms of the topics of the course, but when the courses are taken. So here are some examples. The students observed that in the pathway visualizations, some students spent their first year primarily in one field, but transferred to a completely different field in their second year. Or that they saw some students took an introductory course, but in their final year in a secondary field. And so these are all unconventional patterns and pathways, and they give students inspirations of the diverse ways that they can explore. So finally, I would like to make two discussion points about the implications for researchers that extend beyond this tool. The first point that I want to make here is about the tension between academic interest and major. We saw that on the one hand, major is a useful heuristic for students to think about their interests. But on the other hand, students' articulation of interest can be much more nuanced, flexible, and creative than major. And this is especially important because majors are essentially institutional products, and they may not be as flexible as what the student can think of out of the box, or it may not be as fluid as industry careers, the needs from industry careers at the present time. Also, the requirement to pick a major motivates students to explore their interests. But once declared, major may also constrain interests. And this is important to point out because interest is a developing process, and past research in interest studies have shown that it is important to trigger new situational interest equally in the starting stage of interest development and in later stages of interest development because it can help the evolvement of one's individual interest. And this is especially true now that students are entering career environments that values lifelong learning and constant exploration of new fields. So the takeaway message that I want to send here is that interest often the time it can be an abstract concept for students to grasp on, and it is hard for them to know where to start with. But with academic pathways of past students, it can serve as a concrete and playful object for students to reflect, articulate, and explore their interests. And the second point that I want to make here is the value of making historical course enrollment record data transparent. So many digital advising tools focus on developing prediction models to inform students of academic decisions. And one amazing example is the Ask OSCE system developed by Professor Zachary Pardos. And so here with pathways, we want to show another channel, which is that essentially pathways isn't an highly intelligent AI expert. It shows students descriptive information about other students' choices, but it can be equally, if not more, constructive to support academic decisions. And then also when students observe the variety of pathways out there, the normative message conveyed by past students' academic pathways is very compelling. It shows that there is no standard way of creating a pathway, and it is normal to take time to figure it out. And this can be especially helpful for students to alleviate cases of anxiety or peer pressure. And so the takeaway message that I want to send here is that academic pathways of past students provide a channel to update students' false belief of academic norms with authentic data. So that will be the end of my presentation. Thank you so much. I also want to make a quick announcement that we have been iterating on pathways ever since the evaluation study, and we're just able to launch it last month. We are now, so now it is open to all students at Cornell University. If you go onto this website, it also has a landing page that is open to public. We're in the progress of open sourcing the code. So if you're interested in adopting this kind of system at your institution, feel free to talk to me later or email me through this address. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'll just start off with a question. This is super interesting. Is there any way that you can distinguish between, presumably some pathways are better than others, or maybe not better, but there might be some students who look back on their own pathway and think, oh yeah, I really shouldn't have done that. So is there any way to signal to current students that, this one is like a common pathway, or it's, perhaps a better, more strategic pathway than another pathway?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because like choices of courses, majors, and pathways. This is such an important component in college education, but it's also very hard to quantify or to say which one is better than which. Like maybe like how it's different from how students the learning that happens in classrooms where you can have an exact score. And so what we're trying to do here, I think it would be really interesting for future studies to see if there are some pathways that may have lead to better learning outcomes or other career achievements. But what's here, I also want to emphasize that when students are viewing these pathways, sometimes it's not about the particular pathway that they may follow. Even though there may be a really good match to the student, each student's pathway is just so unique. They would still go on to their own pathway. So it's really the normative message that is conveyed here. When students see, oh, here are some pathways that goes this route that is quite normally set from the beginning, and there are some other pathways that went through 2 years or 3 years of exploration and finally having an answer of a realization of this is my interest. By looking at all of these different outcomes, it may inspire students to think more about their own pathways.
Do we have a question online?
Yeah, so just two quick questions. Basically, what I wanted to know was, what would be the first semester query look like in the search? So like they have no idea about any course, for example, and then they begin using it, right? And in that point, there might be too many things that they actually put together as search query, or probably not put much. And then you could also look at like the progression of this search query over time, like as they get more advanced in their courses, the search query could actually become either shorter or like more terse or like very specific in the query. And also this other aspect is one of your discussion points, which is like the major itself is not very specific, but the courses that it's not very flexible, but then the courses that they take would be, their interests are kind of flexible, and they want that to kind of reflect in the major itself. But would it be possible then that if there is no other course that can actually be offered by the major that also matches their interest, kind of get addressed like at a later point in time once they graduate, for example?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I caught the first one. Did you say about like the search query?
Yeah, like so I saw that there are like 3 steps that you talked about in the formative studies. First was the step 1 where there was a search, right, where they actually type in their interests. So I meant that if that query actually, the properties of that query could be like specific terms as they get more advanced in their courses. And then in the beginning, they're not really familiar with anything. So they might actually use either a very long query, or they might actually not use it also.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And that's exactly something that we want to get at, is that at the start, students may not have a clear idea of their what their interest is. And so through writing down, reflecting on their own interest and writing down it, and also going through, seeing through, browsing through the courses and the pathways, they have this iterative process of having a better idea of what their interest is and writing more. So instead of thinking this as a focus search where students have a particular idea of what their interest is, it's more often an exploratory search. If students have already identified an interest, it would be better if they would go to the course catalog system that like all universities have, when they put in keywords and then the courses will pop up. But here it's more often an open-ended question, and the pathways are meant to be as means to facilitate this reflection process of what one's interest may be.
Thanks. Just the follow-up was that if the major itself is not as flexible in terms of their academic interests, and if they want like some things that are not offered and can be accepted, and they cannot be like an elective, or they cannot be like something that they audit for the major, then would this system actually have an option to recommend that they try this out as a separate major or like something after they graduate, for example?
Yeah, so currently the way that we develop the system right now is that it's more open. So it doesn't have students, it doesn't constrain students to what they're required in a certain major or a certain minor. But I think that's an excellent question. It relates to, I want to pull it back to about like how, because students do face this decision around like exploring interest and focusing on course requirements. And so what I want to say is that with the pathways is developed based on the premise of the US elective system, which the elective system in higher education encourages students to have a breadth of knowledge alongside a depth of knowledge. And given that in mind, sometimes it is not entirely conflict how a student explore their interest and how a student think about requirements. So for example, in the case of Cornell, students have two sets of requirements. One is their major requirements, certainly, but there are also distributed requirements that have like a broader range of course requirements. And we did saw like in the interview students mentioning that they didn't want to take the course in the distributed requirement, but it's in the requirement, so they have to take it anyways. But then they realized, oh, it's actually a really interesting course, and I had misconceptions around it. So this requirement aspect also just shows is one example of this kind of serendipitous discovery, how interest is developed unexpectedly. And I also want to bring another point here, is that by looking at students' decisions from an interest perspective, it also helps us to reevaluate some of the unintended consequences of institutional policies. So like major requirements, as students with multiple interests may want to declare extra majors or minors, or just taking courses flexibly. And the way that these course requirements are set up may have a good impact on how the psychological process that goes through a student in order to decide whether they want to declare a major or not.
Okay, one more quick question and then we'll.
As an institution, how over here? Yeah, as an institution, how many courses? What is my minimum amount of courses, my critical mass, if you will, that I need to provide that kind of unity of pathways to give a meaningful pathways anyway? How many courses do I need as an institution? Do we have a number?
So at Cornell, it's 120 units. And so that would be approximately 40 courses.
Okay, cool. I'm just asking because there's no way that we as a small institution have that kind of number. That's what I would asking what you need as a critical mass. Thank you. I think we all appreciated that kind of planning tool for our own studies.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you so much.